This is a $350 gaming computer I put together recently with used parts. When you hear $350, what are your first thoughts? Is it, oh, that's a decent amount for a PC? Or is it, wow, why even bother? Just get a console at that point. I'm not gonna go down that PC versus console debate. I personally think it's stupid to compare because it's apples and oranges. Let me know when you can play games like League of Legends on console, or when every multiplayer game finally becomes cross-platform so that you can play with the rest of your friends who are playing it via Steam PC while you're on console, or when you can edit a picture on Photoshop or a video in Premiere Pro, do Excel spreadsheets on console, then we can start comparing them as apples to apples. But until then, we keep them separated. But I digress. With regards to price, $350 to me is a decent amount of money to work with if you're familiar with PC parts and the used market. With that, you're going to be able to put together something that'll get you going. It's not going to be like super amazing for all the newest AAA games or anything like that, but for a first PC or for a younger gamer out there who may not necessarily be playing, all the newest AAA titles, then it's a great starting price. This PC specifically, I built using pretty average market prices in the US, meaning if anyone else wanted to put together something that performs similarly with the same amount of money, they should be able to do so without much trouble. So yeah, let's talk about the parts I used. Starting off, we have the processor, the Ryzen 7 1700, which I picked up locally bundled with a motherboard. The 1700 is 7 years old by this point, and I don't know of many people who actively seek it out anymore due to the many other options being available in the used market, but at the time of its release, this was kind of a big deal. It was the first time an affordable consumer-targeted processor boasted this high of core and thread counts, coming in at 8 cores and 16 threads, something that was previously not available for either AMD or Intel in the consumer market. Nowadays, it's starting to get to that point where it's considered kind of old, and I generally recommend to grab something that's Zen 2 or newer if you're going AMD, or 10th gen or newer if you're going Intel. But if you got a limited budget and happen to find one at a decent price like I did, then it's not a bad pick. These are usually going for around $50 on eBay, and locally they should be a little bit cheaper. The motherboard that was bundled is the B450 AORS-M. Honestly, I didn't care what motherboard came with the bundle so long as the total was $100 or less, because the angle I was going for here is upgradability. Sure, the Ryzen 1700 may be pretty old now, but simply being on the AM4 platform means that with a quick BIOS update, it can be swapped out later for a much more current processor like a 5600X or 5800X or X3D. I'm using the stock cooler that the previous owner had with the 1700, which is the Wraith Spire. This actually does a pretty good job at keeping the 1700 cool and doesn't get loud while doing so, which is good enough for me. Saves me around 20 bucks from having to get an aftermarket cooler. For the graphics card, we've got the GTX 1070. When I originally planned this build, I was going to make it $300 and use an RX 580 that I picked up for a really good price locally. But during a recent stream, the viewers and I got into talking about the 1070, and we all came to the consensus that it's low-key still a pretty capable card despite being 8 years old. So that's when I decided to grab a GTX 1070 for this build. I was lucky enough to find an Asus Strix model for $100, which is about the market value of a typical 1070. The more specialty models like this one go for a little bit more, like 110 or 120. I was lucky enough to find it for 100, but had I not found it, I would have been open to grabbing any other model, which is pretty easy to find on websites like eBay and OfferUp. Memory wise, I went with 16GB of DDR4 G-Skill ripjaws at 3200 megatransfers per second CL16. I actually bought this new because memory is cheap enough to not deal with the hassle of buying used. Most of the listings that I was seeing on eBay and the local ones around me for the same specs and capacity was pretty much the same price as new, so I just went to Amazon and called it a day. Storage, on the other hand, is not as cheap, and as a matter of fact has been slowly going back up in price for the last couple of quarters. I opted for this 500GB SN570 from eBay. It was 35 bucks, which kind of stung to buy because barely 6 months ago we were seeing deals on brand new 1TB drives for the same price. Now they're hard to find under 50 bucks. Most of the time, I recommend the bare minimum solid state storage you should be putting into a PC build is 1TB, but for lower cost builds like this one, I think 500 gigs is very passable. Of course, if you can fit in 1TB for the additional $15, then I highly recommend it, but I really didn't want to go over my self-imposed $350 budget, so 500 gigs it is. Next, we've got the power supply, and oh boy, it's been a while since I've used something this far down the power supply tier list. This is the EVGA 600 watt white label. This unit finds itself, are you ready for it? all the way down in the F tier of the popular PSU tier list. Right there, the EVGA W1. Look, I'm gonna be real here. We aren't working with an A tier budget. We've got $350 total. When you have a low tier budget, you're gonna be forced to use lower tier power supplies. I will tell you right now though that I tried to get something better, but nothing was popping up around me or online for around 30-ish bucks, which is how much I had allocated for it. I'm personally comfortable using this unit because it was reviewed in depth by Aris from Hardware Busters, and he clearly lays out the flaws with this unit. Depending on your use case, how much money you have, or just simply availability, you may find yourself having to use something from a less than desirable tier. Now, I'm personally comfortable with this unit after doing my own research. Given the total power draw of the system is less than half of what the rated capacity is, we're going to be pulling well under 300 watts on a 600 watt unit. And in Aris's test and in his video, you know, he said that he reviewed a 500 watt unit, but it died when he applied 110% of the rated load on it. So yeah, we're going nowhere near that. So I'm not expecting any catastrophic failure or this thing burning the system or burning down my house. Last but not least, we have the case, which I went with one of my favorite budget options, the Montage Air 100. It's got a hinged magnetic glass panel, 4 included adjustable RGB fans that aren't powered by Molex, built-in RGB hub, decent room to build in the rear and power supply basement. There are a few cases with this many features at this price point. This thing is pretty much $60 any day of the week. There's definitely cheaper cases out there, but I think once you start going cheaper than this, you start getting into like poor airflow, no glass side panel, noticeably lower build quality, Molex fans, etc. The case is one of those components that is very flexible though, so feel free to let your personal preference dictate what you choose. If you don't like this one, then there's plenty of other options that would be compatible with the rest of the parts in this build. If anything, sometimes I feel like there's too many options to choose from when it comes to cases, and it can get pretty overwhelming, so that's the perfect time to mention the sponsor of this video, Vetted, and their AI shopping agent app. I've worked with Vetted in the past, and they're a company that really aligns with what I do here on the channel because they create free tools to help people find the best products for the best prices. With their new shopping agent, you can tell it which sources you trust, then start asking any shopping related question. Like, let's ask it, can you help me find low cost micro ATX PC cases? Let's give it a second to research. And the really cool thing about this is that unlike other AI chatbots, this is not limited to any time frame. One of the things that I always found annoying about the many AI chatbots out there is that they can only pull information up to like a certain date. Anything newer than that and you get nothing. Well, let's check this out here. So it gave us an answer, and what we see here is the different cases that it thinks fits what we're looking for. It also gives us the different cases down here from different e-tailers and the current pricing on them. From the paragraphs here, you can see how there's kind of brackets and numbers. Those are references, and if you look here, you can see all the different sources it's pulling from. So like, let's click here. So here's Tom's Hardware. We'll click on that. It kind of expands it. We can actually see the actual source itself. And look at that. Look at the date on this article, January 24th, 2024. This is pulling information that is not even a month old yet. This is able to go to multiple sources like Reddit, Tom's Hardware, etc. based on my preferences of me telling it those are the ones I usually look at and those are the ones I trust. You know, it does it in real time, and it's looking specifically for consensus from the various posts and from whatever is written there before it presents you with the information. If you want to look deeper into a case, like if we look here, look, the Montage Air 100, the case I used is actually recommended on here. And if you wanted to, you could go to the Montage Air 100. There it is, 60 bucks. If you want to know more about it, just click on research, and then it's going to give it a second to think. It's gonna do the research. So now it's given a more detailed answer specifically for the Montage Air 100 instead of just generally micro ATX cases like we saw earlier. And here's all the sources and references that it gives. You know, we've got Reddit, Tom's Hardware, another Reddit post, Kit Guru. I've not come across any other AI bot that would be able to extensively give you information like this as current as this. So I think this is pretty cool, and I think it has the potential to help out a lot of people. So if you're interested in checking this out, Vetted's shopping agent is available on all platforms. So that's desktop or mobile on iOS or Android. And you can actually check it out right now by scanning the QR code that I'll put on the screen or by clicking on the link in the description. I want to thank Vetted for sponsoring this video, and now let's take a look at the build summary and price breakdown of this build. So I came in a tad bit under $350 before tax, and taking a look at this from a high level view here, if I could change something about this build, I'd reallocate my budget a little bit. It looks kind of weird to be using a $25 F tier power supply here when I spent $60 on a case, which you could easily argue is mostly an aesthetic piece and has minimal impact to performance. If I were to go back and do this again, I'd likely have spent an additional $25 on a power supply, hopefully one that's at least C tier or better, and then try to find whatever cheap used or even free case that I could in my local area, and if nothing popped up, just go with literally the bottom of the barrel stuff that Newegg or Amazon has to offer. But other than that though, I'm pretty happy with the build given the target budget. Here's a quick montage of me building the system. It took me around 25 if not 30 minutes, and then I'll accompany it with some B-roll afterwards. Alright, let's get to the fun part now, the performance. All games were tested in 1080p because that's the most suitable resolution for components of this age, and the settings per game are specified on the screen. So yeah, let's take a look at the numbers. We'll start off with Cinebench R23 just to get a baseline of the CPU performance and to give you some context of how it performs compared to more current processors. In multi-core, the Ryzen 1700 scored in the high 7000s, and in single core it scored in the mid 700s. For reference, a more modern Ryzen 7 5800X scores in the 15 to 16,000s in multi-core and in the 1500s in single core. Even something very budget oriented like the popular i3 12100 scores in the 8000s for multi-core and in the 1600s for single core, which kind of gives you a good idea of how the 1700 fares today. The core and thread count is helping carry the multi-core performance, but the single core performance is starting to really show its age, which we'll see in some of the games tested. For the games, we'll start with the esports titles, which are likely what most people think about when the price point is this low. In Counter-Strike 2 at max settings, we're averaging above 120 FPS with 1% lows in the 70s, which is good enough to play with a high refresh rate monitor. These numbers are a good bit lower than what they would have been had this been CSGO. The new Source 2 engine is definitely harder to run. In League of Legends at max settings, we're just shy of hitting that 120 FPS average, but we do get improved 1% lows over what we saw in CS2. League is a more CPU intensive game, but it's not optimized for higher core and thread counts, so that's why we see the Ryzen 1700 look like it's barely being utilized, because only a couple of the cores and threads are actually being loaded here. This is where single core performance really hurts the Ryzen 1700, because on a more modern CPU, we'd easily be into the 200 plus range of FPS. Still though, I can't really complain given the $350 budget. In Valorant, we see a similar story, with the Ryzen 1700 being a bit underutilized due to the lack of multi-threaded optimization, but we do get very playable averages and 1% lows that would work very well for those with 144Hz monitors. Alright, esports titles out of the way, now we're moving on to the harder to run games, and we'll start off with Assassin's Creed Valhalla. The system does okay here, averaging 60 FPS, which is nice to see given this is a beautiful open world AAA title, but the 1% low performance is lacking at around 20 FPS. This is pretty noticeable in game as you're going along pretty smoothly and then you get abrupt frame drops on a pretty consistent basis. This is pretty easily visualized on the frame rate and frame time graphs. Whenever you see those spikes and dips just pop up, that's where we get the inconsistent performance. I'm not really gonna blame the GTX 1070 here, it can handle this game just fine. This is definitely the Ryzen 1700 showing its age. And part of it is also due to optimization because later on we'll see other games that are similar to this actually have no problems at all. In the latest Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, using the balanced preset settings with no upscaling, the system averaged in the mid-70s FPS with 1% lows in the mid-50s. Very playable in my opinion. Sure, it wasn't like super high FPS, but hey, it's a AAA game that came out 6 to 7 years after the hardware that we're using in the system, and we're not even playing at the lowest settings, or using any resolution scaling, so yeah, that's a win in my book. In Cyberpunk, we're playing at the preset medium settings, which does have FSR 2.1 turned on by default, so I just left it there at the quality setting, and the system did decently well. Now remember, FSR quality is the equivalent of a 67% resolution, so this is more like we're playing at 720p, but looking at the numbers, it was definitely needed to hit that average 60 FPS mark. Sure, the image isn't as crisp as it could be playing at native 1080p, but we gotta remind ourselves that we're trying to play a graphics heavy game here on a budget. Next up is Diablo 4, which I have to add, I am really saddened by the state of this game right now. Not even a year out and it's already been abandoned by a majority of the player base, myself included. I do have hope though that, like Diablo 3, which had a rough start when it came out over a decade ago, this can get it together and eventually become a good game that people will come back to. But for those of you who are still enjoying it, I'm happy for you and I'm glad to report that it runs on hardware 6 years older than it pretty well. At high settings, I was seeing above 80 FPS average and just shy of 60 FPS 1% lows. Again, this was at high settings, which I found to be pretty impressive considering this game is less than a year old, and the fact that the settings can be turned down even more to medium or low, and we still have FSR in our back pocket if we needed higher FPS. In Fortnite, at high settings, native 1080p with nanite virtualized geometry turned off because that absolutely tanks performance, this system was averaging 90 FPS with 1% lows right at that 60 FPS mark. Fortnite is one of those interesting in-between titles because it is very much esports in that you can run it on a potato if you use the performance mode with the lowest settings, but you could also crank up the graphics basically to the point that performance tanks and takes such a big hit to the point where it's performing like it's a modern AAA title. In Forza Horizon 5, at the preset high graphics settings, the system got a very respectable average 82 FPS with 64 FPS 1% lows. I'm pretty impressed by how the GTX 1070 does here. This game came out 5 years after it, and it runs it without any problems or the need for any resolution scaling or turning down the settings. The image looks crisp, the textures and reflections look great. This is like a prime example of a well-optimized game. In Halo Infinite, which is personally my favorite FPS at the moment, I ran at the preset high graphics settings and we averaged 60 FPS with over 50 FPS 1% lows. Being a fast-ish paced first-person shooter, usually you'd want the most FPS you can get, but I'm not really gonna complain here. We hit that 60 average, the 1% lows were looking good, and we're at high settings, all on a modern live service game on a low-budget used parts PC. The Last of Us was probably the worst performing game of everything I tested. I ran at the lowest graphic settings, and the average FPS was actually pretty good, above 50. Given, the age gap between the game and the 1070, I'd call that good. But the 1% low performance left much to be desired, pretty much ruining the playing experience with pretty constant frame drops. This is similar to what we saw in Assassin's Creed. The only difference here though is that The Last of Us is actually optimized pretty well to make use of higher core and thread count systems. We see the highest utilization of the Ryzen 1700 than we did in any other game, but it goes back to that single threaded performance as well, and this just can't hang, and as a result, we see it bottleneck the GTX 1070 throughout portions of the benchmarking, and it's definitely the culprit of the inconsistent frame rate. With how popular Palworld is, I wouldn't be surprised if there are a lot of people building lower cost PCs specifically to play it, so I had to see how it would perform. At medium settings, I was seeing an average of 70 FPS with 1% lows sub 30. This game is still in early access, so hopefully the 1% lows performance improves over time with each update, but I would say this is a playable experience, and for a game like Palworld, I wouldn't say that you needed super crazy high frame rate. I'm happy with 60 FPS average, but I would like to see the 1% lows improve with more patches over time. In Spider-Man Miles Morales, at high settings, again this system surprised me by performing well. Averaging well over 60 FPS with 1% lows in the 40s. We can see decent utilization out of the Ryzen 7 1700 here, and this goes to show that performance is part on the developers as much as it is on the hardware. Comparing this to Assassin's Creed Valhalla, we're getting a much better gaming experience without super noticeable dips in frame rate, despite both of the games being pretty graphically demanding, open world, and from AAA large studios. So yeah, game optimization is pretty important too. And last but not least, we have Starfield, probably one of the most disappointing releases in recent years, but it is still a pretty hard game to run, so I added anyways. I'm playing at the preset medium settings here, and I should note that the preset settings have by default the render resolution scale to 50%, on top of enabling FSR2. I mean, I get this is a new title and all, but to basically default the graphic settings across all the presets to have FSR2 enabled and lower the resolution scaling by that much kinda speaks on their ability to optimize their game. It's like they're kind of expecting this to run like crap, so they have to pull all these tricks for most people to get decent frame rate. But despite them doing that, we were still seeing sub 60 FPS averages and sub 30 FPS 1% lows. This was playable, but definitely not ideal and was looking kinda blurry. And alright, there you have it, the $350 Ryzen 7 1700 GTX 1070 budget gaming PC. What do you think? Having not used these components in a while, I was actually pleasantly surprised with how they performed in a lot of the newer titles. Like you saw there, they were hanging with some of the more modern games without much issue. Yeah, you're not getting like 144 or like 240 FPS in the majority of them for that like super high refresh rate gaming, but you know, you shouldn't expect to. You can't have these super high expectations while on that super low budget. It just doesn't work that way. You gotta manage your expectations. For the games that this system was struggling on with inconsistent frame rates like, you know, Assassin's Creed and The Last of Us, it really goes to show how the Ryzen 1700 is aging, and that if you can, you know, definitely push for newer processors, even if the core and thread count is lower, because that single threaded performance for gaming, as you saw, can really inhibit it. Like the Ryzen 3600 would have been an ideal option if you can find one at a similar price. Even like an i3 10100 has better single core performance than the Ryzen 1700 even, because it's newer. It comes in at half the cores and threads, so the multi-core performance is, you know, I think a little bit worse, but for gaming, single core performance is still pretty important. At the end of the day though, you know, despite some of the less than ideal performance in select games, I think this build did pretty well overall at $350. But yeah, that's gonna wrap it up for this video though. I hope you found this either entertaining or helpful in one way or another. Let me know your thoughts on the build overall, and for $350 or less, how would you have planned this build differently? What CPU and GPU combo would you have gone for? And also, are any of you out there still rocking the Ryzen 7 1700 or the GTX 1070? Or both? Sound off in the comments below. I'm actually really curious to see. That's gonna be it for me though. I want to thank you all as always for watching and for continuing to support the channel, and huge shout out to the channel members for their above and beyond support. As always, be safe out there, and I will see you all down in the comments as well as the next stream and or video. Bye.